Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us here for our conversation on substation security. I'm Mark Brahmstadt. I'm the Senior Vice President of Client Relationship here at Archer. And today we're going to spend our time talking about enhancing your substation security, CIP 14 compliance, and look at maybe some technologies out there as well to aid you in both of those. Today for the webinar, we've got folks from our team Archer, ACOEM, and WECC on the phone with us as well. Best thing to do is why don't we start with some introductions from the team, and then I'll kind of go over what to expect from here on out. My role today is really just to play facilitator and listen to the three experts that are on with us today. So with that, I guess first, maybe Nick, what I'll do is I'll just give a 30-second overview for those of you that don't know or aren't too familiar with Archer. Here at Archer, we're a full-service cybersecurity, physical security, and compliance consulting organization, really focused on critical infrastructure, specifically in the electric utility, oil and gas, and water spaces. Nick, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll go right around the horn from yourself, Brady, and then Mike. So Nick.
Thanks, Mark. Nick Weber, managing partner at Archer. Prior background was a head of security, Grant PUD up in Central Washington, a WECC auditor for a few years before that, DHS for about 5 years, and about 13 in the military. So kind of bounced all over, finally found what I want to be when I grow up. And all that has pretty much led me to being right around the physical security of substations. So going back to the military time.
Thank you, Nick. Brady?
All right, hello, I'm Brady Phelps. I'm a staff WECC auditor, and I focus on physical security, so CIP 14, CIP 6, and parts of CIP 3. And I have about 20 years of physical security experience. I started off in the U.S. military as well. Moved on to some private military contracting, found my way into Tucson Electric Power, where I kind of started my compliance background and professional development there. And I've been with WECC for 5 years now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Brady, thanks for joining us. And in case anyone's questioning, Brady, can you confirm that the picture on the screen is indeed you?
That is indeed me. The hair moves south for the winter, I think.
Thank you, Brady. Mike, introduce yourself and maybe give folks a little bit of background on ACOEM as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Mike Arnold with ACOEM. Been with ACOEM for over 10 years on a couple different sides of the fence for the company. We are a global company, been around over 40 years. We have three different departments. We have a maintenance department, which deals with reliability and predictive maintenance to keep manufacturing machines running all across the globe. Then we have an environmental division that deals with air quality monitoring, gas analyzers, pretty much anything dealing with EPA monitoring. And then we also have a defense department that we've had for a few decades now, and that's where the acoustic threat detection falls. And we also work with military units around the globe as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Just to maybe set the expectation for today, I've got one more slide here, which we'll pull up. Really, first and foremost, would love for this to be as conversational as possible. All of you should have access to type questions in either the question and answer or the chat section. Send them to us. We've got a few that have already been sent in. And we'd love to answer as many as we can today. We'll record the session and send it out afterwards as well. So really, as it relates to substation security, compliance, no topic is really off limits. And if you have a question that others may learn from, even if you kind of know the answer or are an expert in that area, please ask the question. Help others learn from your experiences as well in this conversation today. With that, I'll take the slides off the screen and just jump into a couple of questions, and I'll be, as the panelists are answering their questions today, I will monitor all of the chats and Q&A, so please ask away all the way throughout. Nick, I'm going to start with you if that's okay, and let's just start at the beginning. What are some good first steps to really securing a substation?
Honestly, the first thing you got to do is you got to figure out what you've got. So it's sitting down with your substation engineers, your transmission planners, excuse me, substation crews, understanding what you're protecting. If you don't know that, you're really going to be spending a lot of time spinning your wheels and going back and forth on things. And there's some key pieces like understanding the difference between replacing a transformer versus replacing I don't know, a disconnect or some switches, how inherently protected a composite bushing is versus ceramic. There's just a lot of those things that until you sit down with some of the folks who really know this stuff day in and day out and push on them a little bit to look at things through the lens of somebody attacking it, which most of them don't normally do. That's I would say the first place. You got to figure out what your gold is and what your pencils are, so you can protect your gold like gold and pencils like pencils.
Thank you, Nick. Brady, how should entities adapt their programs to maybe some of the new and emerging threats? And it doesn't take long for folks to hear some of the new, some of the latest and unfortunate events across the news and literally across the country and North America. What are some ways that they should adapt their program?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's super important right now. I mean, we've all seen the news that's coming out, especially with something that's the new and emerging thing that we're starting to see is coordinated assaults on multiple facilities, right? So with that, the whole way that we're kind of looking at, especially from the SIP 14 R4 and R5 perspective, is not just at singular sites anymore, that maybe we need to start looking at how other sites might affect each other as well. And I think most importantly, what we have to do is to be creative in physical security. So there are design basis threats that we see get used over and over and over again when we're auditing entities. And a lot of that, I think, is partly, this is kind of what we're told we should include from whatever aspect that might be, or it's what we think the auditors might want to see. But when you're really looking at what's happening in the real world, we still see some DBTs or some design basis threats that are identified as really kind of being unrealistic and very hard to defend from. Whereas a compliance team, at least on the WECC side, we want to see realistic threats identified, stuff that has a high probability of occurring. And you're starting to see those emerge once again in the news from December and recently from there. And I think that there's lessons to be learned in each of one of those events that we can get from our daily situational reports, law enforcement reports, and the news coverage that kind of provide the insight into the real world DBTs that we might be looking for. Like, we get to see what these individuals are doing and how maybe they're exploiting our facilities to be able to conduct these attacks. And then take those methods that you're seeing from those sources of information and stand them up against your current physical security measures that you have in place, and also the unique characteristics of your site.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brady. I appreciate that. Mike, I'm going to kind of tee it up for you for a half second. I got a couple of questions that are coming in as well, but I think, Mike, having you talk a little bit about maybe how ACOEM's solution fits into what Nick and Brady kind of teed us up with here initially.
Yeah.
So if you want to start there, and then I'll go to the list of questions. And real quickly, a couple of folks may not have chat enabled. You can still type the questions in the Q&A section. You can keep it anonymous there if you'd like as well, and then we'll go to those. So, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, all good. So yeah, Brady was talking about having the technology and the ways to react to certain threats and getting that data. So ACOEM prides itself, over 4+ decades of getting data to people in real time, whether it be on the environmental side, on the predictive maintenance side with compressors, turbines, stuff like that, keeping manufacturing facilities running. But on the security side with the acoustic threat detection, one of our biggest differentiators is getting people that real-time information so they can take action when a gunshot happens immediately. If you got a bad shooter, he takes 2 or 3 shots, hasn't hit anything, at least that it's happening in real time. And Brady was talking about, the SIP 14, R4, and R5, doing those critical analysis studies, knowing what you need at certain places, whether it's an urban environment or rural environment. That's where our technology really fits in, because we could help you guys or help anybody scale out their security for acoustic threat detection.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. I think that's helpful. Question that came in. I'll tee this one up maybe to Nick and Brady. NERC SIP 14.3, how does it affect renewable energy substations such as switchyards?
I'll jump on that one first. Honestly, it doesn't matter what generation source it's connected to. It's how it fits into the BES. And for 14-3, it's pretty straightforward. Who knows what's going to be coming out of this FERC recommendation or NERC recommendation to FERC in the next month or so. But for now, it's how does it impact the BES, the transmission side. The generation side doesn't touch, or SIP 14 doesn't touch the generation at all, other than those interconnections.
Yeah, you're right, Nick, and it's really the outcomes of the performance of R1 that makes the site applicable or not, and renewables or not. If you're there, you're there. The other part too is SIP 14.3. The biggest thing that came out of that was really that evidence restriction. So as auditors, we used to not be able to see any evidence until we're on site. With these evidence restrictions that came from kind of the COVID lockdowns where we weren't able to travel to the entities to get those, half of the rainforest printed out on paper so we could look at all your documentation. Now we get to see it remotely, which helps, I think, the entities kind of get a head start on the audit itself. And then for us to be able to review that evidence, remotely, and then come fully prepared to audit when we do an on-site review of the implementation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick and Brady. Nick, what are some of the most common misconceptions or challenges you see in substation security?
I think there's two. The first one is that you can do an absolute cookie cutter across the board between sites. You can definitely start, and I recommend starting with kind of a design build and then make it as common as you can, but you still have to be able to tailor it to the specific sites, the threats around that area, what the terrain gives you, what you're protecting, going back to that. That's probably the biggest one. The next biggest one is thinking that there's an end state. That's one of the things that, even going back to when I was running security, one of the questions I always got pushed for is, when are we done? And my answer is, we are never, ever, ever done. That's not security. That's not what it is. It's an arms race, unfortunately. You can future-proof things as much as you want, but you're never truly done. And as soon as you say you're done, then you're done in the wrong way.
And we see that out.
Brady, any additional? Oh, go ahead, Mike, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, we see that out in the real world, whether it's dealing with SIP, stuff or schools or, citywide deployments for our acoustic threat detection. It's people having older systems, not keeping up with technology, and technology changes so fast, whether it's in the security world, anything, it's just changing so fast and so hard to keep up. And like you said, Nick, if you think there's an end game, there's not,
Yeah, so I'll jump in here and agree with Nick that I think one of the biggest compliance shortfalls that we identify during our engagements is that cookie cutter approach to SIP 14. Each site, the words unique characteristics are in the language of the standard for a reason, because each site is going to be unique. And you have to think of, when you're trying to implement a SIP 14 program, or you're trying to continue it down the pathway for the required timelines, you have to look at how unique that site is from the terrain. And now with these recent attacks, is what does your site actually serve, right? Could you be a victim of an attack simply because you power something that somebody wants to get at? And we saw that happen in the Pacific Northwest. So that's a unique characteristic of the site. And it's more than this, this site has 6-foot chain link fence all the way around. It has this many gates. It has this many cameras. That's more of a security assessment, which has its place in compliance and building up that program. But the unique characteristics are, I have a 12-foot wall, but I also have a hill right next to my site, and all of my critical assets are exposed, and I have no way of telling what's going on that hill. Does that lead to a vulnerability or a potential attack vector from a design basis threat? Then that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for to be identified in compliance.
Very good. Thank you, Brady. Thanks, Mike and Nick. We got a couple questions that are similar, so I'm going to bundle them for this one. First of all, is it appropriate to deploy a full perimeter detection and or gunshot detection to be deployed on every substation? And I won't call on someone. I'll let whoever wants to take that one first, because it probably covers all three of you.
I'll go first. It depends. Depends on really. So deploying perimeter detection and shot detection comes in requirement R5, right? This is your physical security plan on how you're going to respond to the information that you developed in R4, and that is your threats and your vulnerability. So how is your site vulnerable, given its unique characteristics, to the threats that you've identified, threats being likely and impactful? So if you develop a particular threat that could exploit your site from every possible angle, then the answer may be yes. But if you also, given the unique characteristics maybe of the terrain of your site, and you're looking at a fairly flat level ground, and you have block wall, but there is that hill next to your substation that allows individuals to see down and potentially have shots on target on your critical assets, then that might be where you want to focus your technology, your time, and your money and your resources, because that is the most likely and prudent avenue that somebody could exploit your vulnerabilities. That's where the focus of the technology should be. It doesn't mean that you have to put it all the way around. We're not looking for, at least in the WECC region, and our audit approach is that mitigation lessen the impact, not completely eliminate. There is no expectation of completely eliminating threats. It's not possible. Somebody somewhere is going to beat whatever you put down.
No.
It's how you develop those threats and how you respond to them in your R5 that kind of determines how much technology to deploy and where to deploy it.
And like you said, Brady, I mean, if somebody has some type of 12-foot wall, if somebody wants to do damage, there's a 13-foot ladder, right? And it depends on, I think, the cost of that protection and how you can apply it. So if whether it's medium, high, low voltage, whatever, the difference between cameras and sensors versus a ballistic wall or apples to oranges, right? And if you can protect some of those lower costs, maybe ones you don't have as big of a threat, but if the ROI is there on transformers or other things that can be damaged by one guy taking a shot at it, if it allows you to have that real-time data and whether it's shed loading or de-energizing certain components to save them, it's kind of looking at different, applications, like you said, I guess. So it could apply anywhere.
And I'd answer the question with a question. It's if you don't have any sort of detection on this, or you don't have enough detection to respond before you can at least minimize the impact, then what's the point of doing anything else? Because without detection, then you have no delay. I know going back to some of the R6 work I've done, where there is no perimeter detection or beyond perimeter, or even detection on critical assets, your delay is absolutely zero because you don't know that you have something going on until your system starts or your components start to break. So I think that kind of wraps it back in, though. Mike and Brady both made great points. You got to know what you're looking for and know what you're protecting against.
What you all just talked about kind of lead into the next question that was asked as well. And risk levels. Who's responsible for determining the risk levels of the generating assets?
So for physical security compliance, that's a business decision. And my recommendation on that is it's a team. There's no one person, no one group that's really going to have all those answers. You got to talk to your operations folks, your plant managers. You have to talk to, obviously, your safety people. That's going to be another piece of it. Your risk folks. It's going to be a whole piece. And of course, the finance, because there's money decisions being made there too. But the biggest thing is what can your organization, what risk are you willing to accept? Financially, reputationally, operationally, a lot of stuff, especially again, the generating side.
Got quite a few more questions coming in, so I'm going to keep going right through them. Over the last year and more, it seems there has been an increase in malicious physical substation intrusion attacks incidents. Choose your word there. Is this apparent higher incident count at least partly a result of more frequent reporting by utilities? Might this be a significant part of the phenomenon?
So, I mean, I'll jump first and say no. I think what we're seeing now is more of the proof of concept copycat attack. There's been requirements to report all of these for years. So I don't think the reporting has really changed. The public are paying attention to it. That's probably come up a little bit, but higher profile piece.
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with that. Like Nick said, I mean, looking into this stuff has been going on for decades. But when you start dealing with Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all these, it's less than a 24-hour news cycle. So we have access to so much information where, what happened in North Carolina, if that happened in, 1983 instead of 2023, you might have never heard of it. Or if you were outside of, the East Coast, you didn't hear about it, So I think it's just a sign of the times of how quick information goes out and how people are getting it. So
from WECC's perspective, I can't really comment on the aspect of reportable cybersecurity incidents and that kind of thing and how effective it is or not. But what I can say is that in July of 2022, it was brought to my attention that there was an increase in some sort of anti-government, anti-industrial technology type groups, right? That started publishing books and even releasing them on paperback and on Amazon. In a particular group called Garden, they issued Garden number 3 in July of 2022, and where they specifically called out, I think 15 of the biggest substations in the Eastern Corridor, as well as critical pathways in the West, as far as their research and their determination of what would be critical. And what was most interesting out of that is that they referenced Metcalf, but they referenced as a failure because they were simply attacking one site. And all that really did was then bring about SIP 14. So it brought in more protections. It brought in a higher attention to our electric substations and our bulk electric system as a whole, without actually causing any kind of cascading instability or separation, right? So in that book, they're talking about we need to wait. We need to make sure that we attack multiple sites at the same time. And so now we're starting to see, I'm not sure if the two are related or whatever it may be. I just found it interesting that now we're having publications saying coordinated assaults are the way to go. And then over the holiday break, we had some coordinated assaults.
yeah, and they also had a piece on that on 60 Minutes, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, where they talked about coordinated assaults on different, grid infrastructures and stuff like that.
There was a couple more in here that just popped in. What percentage of the substations that are audited use their current detection systems, for example, CCTV, to detect and monitor outside of the perimeter of the substation in areas that could be used by an adversary that would be conducting pre-attack planning and surveillance? I don't know if you can answer that one.
I can speak for the West, knowing that CCTV technology at a minimum is about 100% on SIP 14 sites. It's about one of the most basic things that you could do. But that's great to have CCTV, but what is it there for, right? Some of the compliance issues that we're finding is that we can install all the technology in the world, but if we're not driving its purpose in our R5 physical security plan and tying them directly to the threats and vulnerabilities identified in R4, what is it really doing? And on the other side of that are the people that are responsible for protecting or reacting to those situations. Are they knowledgeable of SIP 14 and why that site's critical? I see all the time that our primary response and communication method might be our security operations center people. But when I talk to security operations center people, they've never heard of SIP 14. So they look at the sites, but they don't know what they're looking at or why they're looking at it and why it might be critical, because these sites are identified in R1 as being your most critical sites. So do we know the why behind the technology? And really that CCTV, it depends on its effectiveness. Does it have analytics? Is it eliminating that human element of error where humans make really bad, detectors? We're great at assessment, but if we stare at a CCTV monitoring screen for more than 15 minutes, we almost become worthless. So do we have the analytics within our cameras to be able to identify threats and alert those operators to then begin the assessment process is super key. And then really pushing out that detection, I think, is one of the most effective things that you can do in SIP 14, is because the whole R5, 5.1, right? That's the big part of SIP 14 R5. How are we deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and responding to these threats? It's linear. So obviously, if we can deter, that's great. Then we need to detect. But once that detection occurs, now you're starting a timeline. And that timeline is how fast can we respond to and intercept the adversaries from accomplishing their mission of cascading instability and separation. So if you can push out the detection further and then buy your response more time to arrive and then mitigate that threat, now you're meeting the compliance standard.
Yep. And that goes back to kind of Nick talking about there's no end game in technology. So whether it's through your camera system or having, ACOEM's technology with acoustic threat detection, there's so many other force multipliers out there with virtual fencing, license plate recognition. So if you have the same car that's doing some reconnaissance on some of your substations and stuff like that, having the ability to identify that, not with a human interface, but through some type of third-party software, through your VMS, and then virtual fencing, if somebody crosses a line, know about it, know who they are. And then, of course, if they fire a shot, knowing about it immediately. So you can take action upon that. So I agree.
Yeah, and I would say the other piece that we haven't really touched on, though, is the terrain analysis side of it. You've got to do that on the front end so you know where to look for those pieces. Kind of come back to the original question of getting very targeted and that beyond the perimeter. That's one of the things whenever I look at a site, if they haven't done a systemic terrain analysis, and I like to use what tool I learned in the Army, the OCC, observation, avenues, approach, key terrain, obstacles, cover and concealment, and then throw in the old DHS surveillance detection on top of it. Where can somebody sit and look at my stuff and what can they see that's important?
Yep.
And when you find those spots, dial in that beyond the perimeter. And if you see somebody hanging out there, send somebody up, make them uncomfortable, make them known they're watching. So I don't see a lot of that, but it's growing. That answers the question. It's at maybe 5 to 10%, but rapidly increasing because it's a great way to cost effectively point your tools in the right spot.
Yeah. So one of the advantages with ACOEM's acoustic threat detection is the coverage area of one of these sensors that we have. So we cover about 750,000 square feet with one sensor. So when you put that in most of the substations that we've mapped out across the country, we expand our acoustic protection outside of that substation. So if somebody's shooting from a Walmart parking lot or elevated hill, like Brady said earlier, we can detect that. So even if they're not even close to the perimeter of the substation and taking shots from a distance, we can still pick that up. The other neat thing is we have the ability, since our technology was developed back in the 90s for the U.S. Army and NATO, we have the ability to detect snipers. So if somebody shoots anything that's a supersonic round outside of our coverage area, so even if somebody shoots something from half a mile away, if it passes through the perimeter of that substation, we will detect it. So we expand that acoustically so much further than any camera could ever think about.
There was a quick question. Brady, I think you mentioned a book title. I think that was you. Someone's asking for that book title again.
It's called Garden Issue number 3. I did see that there's Garden, Garden. There's an issue 1 and 2 that touches a little bit on substations as well, I think, in issue 2. I haven't seen issue 1. But again, these were discovered through Telegram and kind of these groups that are forming in these chat apps and stuff that we have now. And so you can definitely find that book on Amazon. I purchased it, kind of half expect the FBI to knock on my door at the same time, but it was for research purposes, right?
Wonderful.
You're already on their list.
Thanks, Brady.
Yeah, been for a while, that's for sure.
Okay, we got quite a few questions here. I'm going to maybe go a little rapid fire here on a couple of questions. So take them how you want, whoever wants them. Do you recommend that utilities take the EISAC's visa course?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with it. The little bit that I've seen, yes. And honestly, anything you can go to learn to throw in your tool bag, yes.
Wally, great comment. Detection is useless without response. Absolutely. That was in reference to the prior conversation.
The key to that, Mark, though, is the speed in which you get the data to respond. So we like to allow our end users to control their acoustic threat detection system, so we don't filter anything out. There's no middleman. You're getting alerts in 3 seconds or less. And of course, like we've talked about many times, we can't stop somebody from pulling a trigger, but if you know the first time they pull the trigger and you can respond, whatever your protocols are, then we can help eliminate things that might happen after that first shot is fired.
I got a quick question for Mike, actually. Yep. So some of the entities that I audit, they are interested in shot detection technology, but then they're also positioned in a place where there might be a lot of hunting, or maybe there's a nearby shooting facility. I can think of one from a former entity where there is a law enforcement shooting facility within 100 yards of the SIP-14 site. How would an entity deal with that?
So another neat differentiator in our technology is we pair with a PTZ camera. Okay. So when we get an alert, we slew to cue that camera to where the threat's coming from. Okay. So you get audio and visual of what's going on instantaneously and mapping of where the threat's at. So depending on where it's at, if you know the location, you can hear the sound, and obviously you can see with your own eyes what's going on, then you can assess it from there. Most hunters are not going to shoot more than once in a quick response, right? So even if they miss the animal they're hunting, they're not firing again within 2 seconds. They're setting up again. Hopefully the animal didn't run off. So there's usually a longer delay in hunting shots. Now, if it's duck hunters or something like that, a little bit different, but we would identify that as a different type of threat with a shotgun. We give you a lot of information with eyes, ears, and mapping, so you can kind of see what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of our entities, a big primary concern and focus is how do we eliminate nuisance alarms, so false positives.
Yep.
Is there a way for the technology, and I'll use an entity as an example that has a law enforcement training facility right next door. Is there a way to kind of geo map that certain area can be kind of ignored?
Yeah, we can, depending on setting it up for that site, we can definitely do that. Now, as far as false alarms, and whether it's car backfires, 4th of July fireworks, stuff like that, we have the ability to distinguish between gunshots and acoustic threats or explosions versus a firework or a car backfiring. We also have multiple neural networks. We have over 20 different neural networks. So we let the sensors kind of rough into their environment and learn their environment over a short period of time, so we can eliminate some of the false positives.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And then we would
Wonderful.
also use that mapping detail if something's going on at that firing range, if we know where it's coming from. So
Excellent. Thank you. Great questions, Brady, and thanks, Mike, for those. Tom, just a comment from Tom. R4 requires the assessments. I like Brady's emphasis on pushing out the detection beyond the perimeter of the substation in the R5 plan. I think we talked about that in a couple different avenues as well. So thanks, Tom, for that comment. What is the most likely cost-effective measure that isn't typically being taken that could be taken to drive down risk?
Exercises. It's actually testing your stuff. And I can say that in the last 6 months, we've seen the difference between a utility that's exercised between their security and operations and those who haven't. And the outcome was significantly better for those who had. Kind of comes back to Brady's point of what's the human on the other end of all that technology doing, taking it a step farther. Do the people who are operating your systems, your grid, do they know enough to take the information security can provide them and make an informed decision?
I think, yeah, Nick, so testing definitely helps shape your threats as well. So if you think you might have a threat based on what maybe the EISAC is telling you, what NERC is telling you, what your buddies at another entity who just went through a WECC SIP 14 audit are telling you, but really you combine that with your unique characteristics and then you test that threat against what you have, right? So one of the most impressive and things that I've seen during audit is IEDs came up. So person-borne IEDs. Could we throw a small pipe bomb over our fence and hit our critical assets? So what they did is they took, okay, it's a 10-pound bomb, is going to be large enough to affect some of our critical assets. We're going to stand outside of our fence line. We're going to grab the strongest lineman that we can find, and we're going to see how high and how far he can throw a 10-pound dumbbell. And we're going to then measure the explosive radius, the effective range of a 10-pound pipe bomb, and then run those numbers based off what the DHS can provide, because they provide explosive charts and radiuses and things like that for different types and sizes of explosives. And what that entity identified is the strongest guy they could find could not throw it high enough and far enough to get within that effective range of the explosion on a 10-pound device. And what they did is they essentially eliminated IEDs from their threat spectrum, just based on the unique characteristics of the site, where their fence was positioned and how far back their critical assets were. And that goes back to the testing.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Next question. If and when executive leadership decides to accept the risk that you've laid out, how would you recommend capturing and documenting that to show your recommendations and what was or wasn't followed?
So they don't get to accept certain risks. If it's a compliance requirement, accepting a risk is not appropriate. I think we've seen that a bit, SIP 10, SIP 13 a bit. When it's beyond compliance, write it down. I know there's some executives that are still annoyed with me because I strongly disagreed with something they were doing. I gave them a recommendation. They didn't act on it. So I drafted up, here's my recommendation. Understand you're not acting on it. Signed it with my certifications behind it and sent it with a read receipt and then PDF the whole package. And I don't work there, but I still have that PDF package. So CYA, that's a government trick that I learned, honestly.
Yeah, Nick is right about the accepting risk. If you find yourself with a SIP 14 applicable site, you do have to go through the compliance aspects of performing that threat and vulnerability assessment, and then developing a physical security plan, and then have that unaffiliated third-party review that plan. Where we see most of the threat or risk, acceptances are, we realize that vehicle-borne IEDs might be a thing, but however, looking back at, when is the most recent event? So we might look at the Winnebago bombing in Nashville, Tennessee, right? That wasn't particularly aimed at critical infrastructure, aside from maybe AT&T, but then going back from there, you have Oklahoma City bombing. So stuff that one was sort of recent, but not really tied to critical infrastructure. The other one was not tied to critical infrastructure, but was a big deal, but we haven't really seen anything since. So we are aware of the threat and we're documenting that threat within our our threat and vulnerability assessment. However, these are the reasons why we're not necessarily doing all this, spending a ton of money on ways to mitigate VBIEDs, because it's just not what we're seeing as likely in the US right now. And honestly, putting together explosives, I think, is very hard in the United States. We do have a lot of good protections against that. Does it happen? Can it happen? Sure. But I think that likelihood, entities have done a good job of writing down and documenting the process that they go through to identify the likelihood being so low that they're aware of it, but we're not necessarily doing anything directly, but we have the capability in the future, should that threat spin up, that we can then implement additional measures. Drones is another really good example of that. Can we really do anything to legally mitigate drones right now? Not a lot, but what entities are doing is they're saying we're aware of it, we're watching it, we're staying abreast of federal laws and also technologies used to deal with those things. But as of right now, the best thing we can do is put up a no drone sign. And from a compliance standpoint, if you're identifying, yes, these are current threats, and also these are other threats that we're aware of, then our audit approach is to look at those two differently.
Their piece to look at, I would say, the drone one got me thinking about it too, because I had a lot of good conversations the last couple of weeks about this. Is what can an attacker really do with a drone to a substation? At the current commercially available technology, honestly, there's not a lot. Could that change tomorrow? Absolutely. Keep track of it. The other piece to look at is the attacker still making a business decision. Are there things could they try to deliver something with a drone? Sure. Why are they going to spend a couple $1,000s to do that when they could cut the fence for 10? Those are still some of the things you got to look at and kind of put I call it the red hat on. That's what, when I was in the military, was that we were the OP4. We always had the little red star on our uniform. We were the bad guys. You have to be able to think like them and understand their motivations and rationale as well.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for that follow-up. We've only got a few more minutes here. I'm going to go through a few more questions, and please keep sending your questions in. If by chance we don't get to them all, we will surely email you directly or respond back to the group that attended here today. Using cell phone geofencing technology, is there a way utilities, carriers, and law enforcement could pre-collect suspicious activity and somehow hold that information in escrow without obviously trying to violate privacy?
That's going to depend on your jurisdiction. Best way to do that is have that relationship with law enforcement and ask them what they can do. But chances are the answer is going to be no. And your general counsel is probably gonna do earmuffs and say, "Get out of my office."
Like it. Does anyone recommend inexpensive polymer composite panels on transformer areas vulnerable to ballistic destruction?
I'd say it depends on that one. What's your threat? What's the sight line? What range can somebody shoot at from? And what's it going to do potentially to that equipment? You got to talk to the engineers behind that too. If you're blocking any critical airflows or any of those pieces, there's just a lot of stuff. When you get into shielding, I'm not a big fan. I'll tell the story when I first got into the military in 2001. The M1 Abrams was pretty much invulnerable to anything that wasn't in the air. Within 2 years of being on the ground in Iraq, it was quite the opposite when EFPs got introduced. The more you throw out armor, the more somebody gets a chance to figure out how to beat it.
Yeah, from the compliance side, Nick, you nailed it there, is what is your threat, right? So some of the shortfalls that we've seen in compliance is during audit engagements is, well, look, we've put up ballistic shielding. What is the rating on that? 9mm. Okay, what's your threat? Well, you've identified 7.62 as a threat. So really that shielding that you've put up doesn't match the threat that you've identified. So what did you actually accomplish? So really nailing down that threat and getting granular with it, because you get to write your own test from a compliance side on SIP 14. You get to tell the auditors what your threats are. Now we get to use a little bit of professional judgment and what's reasonable. You can't come and say we have no threats. Everybody has some kind of threat. But as long as your threats are reasonable and prudent, that's what we're going to audit to. And so you need to tie the measures in 5.1 and everything else in your physical security plan to the threats you develop.
Very good. Thank you. Mike, I'm going to throw a couple questions your way all in one, couple very specific technology questions some folks are curious about. How are you mounting the camera and shot detector, and how are you powering it is the first one.
We have several different options when it comes to that. If people have existing NDAA compliant PTZ cameras, we typically like to mount our sensor next to that PTZ so we can pair with it. So if we do get a threat, we can salute a cue to that threat to give you eyes with your ears. As far as the powering of the sensor, it's PoE powered, very low power draw at 6 watts, which also gives us the ability, if you have portable trailers or other things you want to move around, our sensor can be moved around. It doesn't have to be fixed there. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. And follow-up question then. I know the answer to this one, but I'll let you answer it only because I asked you the other day. Can shot detection technologies detect suppressed gunfire, subsonic gunfire, or both?
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole there. But to answer your question, yes, we have detected suppressed fire. Matter of fact, we did it 2 weeks ago over in Texas to prove it to somebody. Now, when you start getting into suppressed 22 with subsonic rounds, then you start getting a little hairy there. But general 223, 556, 762, 308, stuff like that with a suppressor, we've pretty much been successful in detecting it.
That includes, let's say, 556, the most common, one of the most common rounds out there. That's suppressed with subsonic ammo?
Yeah. Yes. Now our coverage radius kind of shrinks with that, so one sensor, and we haven't really talked about this, we have the ability to localize a threat with one sensor. So I don't need a network of sensors. So the scalability for substations and stuff, rural area, urban, it works perfect for this, for the SIP standards. So one sensor can localize a threat. It covers a 500-foot radius. When you start getting into suppressed fire, it shrinks it down a little bit, especially if they're using subsonic rounds. So I hope that answers your question.
Question from Charlie. What entity is responsible for compliance standards and inspections?
Brady Phelps. That's the answer. FERC for most of this. Up in Canada, it's provincial. But a couple different federal or a couple different government groups that are involved in this at the transmission level. So in the US at the state level, or the distribution side, the 100 kV generally and below, it's a state level. So it's kind of it depends answer.
Hey, Brady, I'm gonna go back real quick just to give you a little bit more in depth on the suppressor stuff. The reason we can still do that is because we're not just looking for a loud noise or just a muzzle flash. we're looking for bullet travel noise as well. So that's when I was talking about earlier, the ability to detect bullets from a far distance if they travel through that radius. We're looking for several things other than a loud noise like other gunshot sensors are looking for.
Right. Yeah. So there's the noise from the gun, actually the firing pin, right, hitting the round and causing that small explosion. And then there's also the round itself breaking the sound barrier.
Yep.
Which
and there's bullet travel noise as well.
Bullet travel.
Yep. And we developed this, I think I said it earlier, but we developed this back in the 90s for the U.S. Army and NATO. And we've continued to develop this technology, and we just released it to public use back in 2019. So this is new to public use, but still in the military sector.
Yeah, we couldn't afford that in the Marine Corps, I don't think.
It's actually, not to get into price points, but it's a pretty good price point. So
that was back then.
The Marines don't let them have anything that wasn't Vietnam era. They might be now getting in Desert Storm. So
yeah, don't use the Marine Corps' budget as a price point. That's for sure.
So just a couple more questions. Are in a serious EMP attack is a threat to the nation's bulk power grid. Where do you guys fit into the picture with respect to this threat? So I'm not sure who you guys are, so I'll throw it to any one of you three. Where do you fit in?
I'll jump in real quick from the SIP-14 side, right? When we're doing our outreach and we're trying to help entities become compliant and learn how to do this, we preach and I've actually been preaching this since I worked at entities doing SIP-14 and kind of sharing my knowledge and experience on how I accomplished SIP-14 from the entity side is this isn't the global war on terror. So stay away from nation state type level attacks. Because really, if you can figure out how to stop those things, then you need to let the DoD know, because they're still trying to figure out how to stop these things. And what we're not looking at that level of things. And sometimes entities, once you identify a threat, right, that starts R5, where you have to come up with a way to deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond. And it breaks my heart when I see a 5-man terror group, highly trained, willing to die, coming after your site. This isn't the global war on terror. We're really looking for those guys. They're 2 dudes that had illegal weapons in Pacific Northwest that decided they wanted to attack a couple of sites because they wanted to rob the next door store. That's the reasonable and prudent threats that we're looking at in SIP-14.
Great answer, Brady. Thank you for that. Last 2 questions. Please discuss some of the tools the group uses to educate clients concerning NERC SIP physical security compliance. I'm not sure which tools are being referenced there to teach.
If you know you're in the WECC region, you know you're in the WECC region. So we have, WECC has a physical security working group. Really, and what I see is that the entities who participate in that generally have higher levels of compliance than those who do not, because it's an opportunity for all of the physical security SMEs to get together in a closed room. They used to meet twice a year. They might be down to once a year and then once remote due to COVID. But, I used to be the vice chair of that. Nick, I'm pretty sure you were a chair of that as well. But we get together and we're in a room and we get to talk about the good, bad, and the ugly from our audits, what we learned, do an after action. We get to complain about the auditors. Then you generally get an hour of stump the chump, where I get to stand in front of all the physical security guys and they get to ask me all the tough questions and try to get me to stumble over myself. And it's a lot of fun. We get to butt heads, but a lot of learning comes from that. Also, WECC holds reliability and security workshops where we talk about these things in front of the broader audience. And then also my approach is, it's not, me as an auditor versus the entities. I come from the entity side. I know what it's like to be in their shoes. Our goal is the protection of the beds. So I open my phone up to anybody, and it's very rewarding when a physical security SME can call me up and say, Brady, I want to get your thoughts on this part of SIP-14. And we can just talk shop. There's nothing better in my workday than be able to just talk physical security with the SMEs that we serve. So lots of opportunities that way in the Western region.
So I would say the WECC ones, as far as the regions, I don't think anybody else is active as WECC in this one. And honestly, that goes back quite a ways, even before I was at WECC, kind of the heavy focus on the outreach. But the ISAC's also got a pretty good suite of tools. I know Ross mentioned the Visa tool earlier. ASIS, the utility security community, is another good spot to go. infrastructure security community as well. And then the other one, I'm going to kind of be a little self-serving. At Archer, we've got a YouTube channel. We throw out content multiple times a week. It's not necessarily always physical security, but it's always around utility security, compliance, those pieces. So check that stuff out. It's free, and it's usually a pretty quick hitter. I think our longest ones were probably our podcast at about a half hour.
And that's why I'm sitting here, because I would go to Archer's YouTube channel to learn. So
thanks, Nick. You beat me to that one. I appreciate that very much, obviously. Got just a couple of minutes left. There's a couple of questions out there. Number one, what are your thoughts about thermal radar cameras?
I think there's a good spot for them. They definitely provide a benefit. We used them a little bit at Grant on our mobile trailers. Really helpful to be able to throw that up. Obviously, you're going to be terrain dependent on that. If you've got a good clear line of sight, then it could be a great tool, but you got to look at vegetation, what kind of shots you can get, and then the maintenance on some of those can get kind of hard, especially if you're somewhere that's a little bit harsher terrain, too cold, too hot. Anytime you have moving components, it's always a higher risk of things breaking down.
And if you're in a heavily, like you said, your terrain, I mean, you start losing it, a couple feet into the woods, it's not even worth it. So, yeah,
the best thing is to understand the pros and cons of every technology out there and pick the right one for you. Don't pick the one that you think you need because you've got it somewhere else.
Yeah. And I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is all about uptime, keeping things running, keeping things safe, and your ROI based on the technology you're putting in there. So, I mean, that's what everybody's looking at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that all of these technology questions, they all have the foundation of what are the unique characteristics of your site and what are the threats that you've developed. And if your unique characteristics are ones that have a super remote substation, flat ground, you can see, a very long distance, then something like a thermal technology might be a good option to support your detection and assessment capabilities. But then take that same substation and throw it right in the middle of the city might make that thermal technology useless.
Mike, Brady, and Nick, I want to thank you guys for your time, your expertise, and for sharing that all with us. I know there's probably lots of questions out there. It was nonstop questions for us. So if we did not get to all of your questions, you've got some more that were generated from this conversation. I'm going to send everyone that attended an email. And you'll have my contact information. You can reach out to me directly. We did record this session, and we will make some nice edits to it and get it out there for you to share with your peers as needed also. And we'll share it on our YouTube channel that Nick mentioned. With that, I'll leave with my phone number just mentioned real briefly, 503-347-0052. You can call me, but I'll make sure everyone gets an email from us. Really appreciate everyone's time, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Contact us to change the way your company thinks about security.